Hey everyone, welcome to review number 16. Today we are lucky to have Shona Halson on. She is episode number 2 in our ACU Sprint Research Series. So I'm not going to delve too much into Shona's history and everything. I'd rather let her talk about herself. So Shona, you run the recovery section of the Sprint Research department, is that correct? Do you want to give us a little bit of background about yourself and your research?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Jamie. So I actually started out, I did my PhD in Birmingham, actually, in the UK, with ACU control. So that was a very good experience for me. So after I finished my undergrad in Australia and honours in Australia, I headed over to the UK for a few years. And then straight after that, I started at the Institute of Sport in Canberra here in Australia. So I did 16 years there, and my role was a combination of servicing and research. Was fortunate enough to lead the recovery area at 3 Olympics for the Australian team. So that was a great experience. And so yeah, lots of research really around the recovery space. So, you know, Australia is very, like other countries, are very evidence-based. And so we wanted to sort of add some information about mechanisms and how to use some of these recovery strategies. So not just do they work, but how do they work? And obviously, if we understand how they can work, we have a better chance of being able to implement them in practice. So it was a real sort of combination of research and servicing, so direct working with athletes. And then in 2018, came across the ACU. So the obviously a great team there, and was a nice choice, and one that I'm happy with. Happy that they had me, and yeah. So my role now is primarily around research. I do some teaching in the Masters of High Performance Sport program, but primarily in research and around recovery, and then of course within recovery, still in the sleep space.
Yeah, okay, fascinating. So, and before we get into a bit of the Sprint background, how did you get into sleep science? What triggered you to say? Because I mean, you obviously, I wouldn't, before buffing you up too much, you're one of the pioneers of sleep science, really, well, modern day sleep science, if you will. So, how did you? What made you think there's not enough research here? And there still isn't, which you've obviously noted in some of your papers. What triggered that for you?
Yeah, it's a combination of a couple of things. I think the first and the main thing was talking to athletes themselves who had some interesting questions around sleep. And so it became fairly clear to me that it was an area that there wasn't a lot of knowledge in terms of the athlete not understanding what poor sleep might be, and then if they were a poor sleeper, what they did about it. And of course, what you do as a scientist, you go to the literature, and there's nothing. And I was like, well, there was lots of research on exercise and sleep, and showing that exercise was good, but actual elite athletes and sleep, there was nothing. So realised that, as a foundational aspect of an athlete's health and well-being and performance, it's something that we need to know a lot more about. And then it was really fortuitous. It was one of those things that, I don't know, meant to be, I don't know, whatever way you look at it, but the head of physiology at the time was Professor Chris Gore, and he went to his, I think it was his 20-year university reunion down in Adelaide, and he met up with a guy called Professor Drew Dawson, who happens to be one of the leaders in sleep research in the world. And they just started talking, and then, of course, that connection led to some collaborations and some large Australian Research Council grants, and we sort of moved from there. But it really started from that, well, recovery is important, and we don't know anything about probably the best recovery strategy we have. And when we think about training, eating and sleeping being 3 fairly important aspects, or the most important aspects to an athlete, and we don't know anything about one of them. So that's kind of what got us started.
Fascinating. And then moving on to Sprint, so the recovery section, what research has been conducted at the moment, and what's the plan for the recovery section, whether that be sleep science, and what other aspects of recovery are you guys focusing on?
Yeah, so I will take a fairly strong focus on sleep. So we'll look at a couple of areas within sleep. Now we want to look at some interventions. So we've started to do the research now, understanding how athletes sleep and why they might not sleep as well. So let's look at some interventions, particularly around nutrition, As David Opar mentioned when you were talking to him, we've got Professor John Hawley and now Louise Burke with ACU. So madness not to collaborate with those two. So we'll take a bit of a nutrition focus, and I'll also collaborate with them in some of their areas in populations like, diabetes, etc. So we'll also take we'll look at some sleep research in time-restricted feeding and some of those other aspects. But the other area we are really interested in with sleep is the female athlete. We know very little about changes in sleep across the menstrual cycle, and indeed we know very little about female sleep at all. So that's one of the other focuses. I still have a couple of PhD students that work in the hydrotherapies and compression aspect of recovery. So they're students that I've been working with since the AAS, and obviously we'll try to continue to do some of that work around recovery in other aspects, not just sleep. And then the final one is really looking at linking with some of the psychologists that I've worked with at the AIS. We're really linking in the area of stress and sleep in athletes. And what level of stress do you need to get to before it interferes with sleep? And what can we do about it? And how do we manage stress, particularly around major competition?
Fascinating. So one you touched on that fascinates me as well is the females and sleep, because obviously there's been quite a big push in recent years on, the change of the female athlete triad to the, red S and all of that, and changing training loads to menstrual cycles. So when is that research going to get underway? Have you started some of that research, looking at the menstrual cycle and sleep, or is that just still to come?
Yeah, I've got some data collected that we're analysing, and we've used an objective measure of sleep, but more of a subjective measure of the menstrual cycle. So the next step is to have objective measures of both. So let's get into the measurements of the hormones, as well as obviously the objective measures of sleep. So again, we hear subjective reports of female athletes not sleeping well at certain phases of the cycle, but now we just want to actually determine, is that really true or not? And what might some of the mechanisms be? Is it around just the changes in hormones, or is it temperature related? So there's a range of different aspects. And then obviously, slightly separate to that, but when you're talking about REDS, we in the general population, we know that restricting dietary intake can have an influence on sleep itself. So there's whenever I'm looking at diagrams of how, whether it's, things like insulin or glucose or in any aspect of metabolism and physiology, it's like sleep just fits in there somewhere, and it's often one of the things that's not measured. So I think we're going to try and get this multidisciplinary approach where we can sort of combine things. And so having a range of different aspects to look at, not just, okay, so what's performance and what's their physiology? Well, how did they sleep as well?
Yes. Okay, great. And then I know you touched on, what you guys will be looking at, but what does the future of the recovery program hold? Where do you see it in 5 or so years with the types of projects that are coming out, the collaborations, anything on the horizon? So the future.
Yeah. So I guess the future for me looks a little bit, if I could plan things the way that I'd like. At the moment, we just don't have the human resources. So it's an area where, to bringing in some more PhD students and potentially looking at some postdoctoral researchers to just build up the actual staff that we've got to be able to do these projects. I think for me, it's a combination of, I've always loved working with the elite athlete, and that's where most of my working life has been. And ACU are fantastic in that they allow me to continue to do that work and have that focus on the elite athlete, but also to be able to do some meaningful work in a patient population. So as we know sleep has a role with diabetes and weight management and a range of metabolic disorders. So to kind of feel like you kind of get that warm fuzzy feeling that you might actually be helping people. I think that's part of the other aspect of making sure that we've got that collaboration with John Hawley's group, but without still losing the elite athlete aspect of things, but females and males, of course.
Okay, great. And do you have anything, I know with current circumstances it might be a bit different and difficult, is there anything, if I'm a current PhD student or finishing my master's or whatever the case is, do you have anything at the moment that anyone could look at, or postdoctoral even?
Yeah, we will be advertising a purely sleep PhD towards the end of the year. So we've got some funding for that. And potentially there may be one, there may be two, may look, depending on exactly what it looks like. But yeah, so for us, it's building that base around the staffing for that research. So one, maybe two PhD students, and then of course, anytime we can get postdoctoral research funds, we will be trying. So that's so that's the next thing.
Cool, interesting. So that's it's always interesting just to see what's out there, and especially with the current circumstances.
Yeah.
But yeah, and then so obviously you've identified the females menstrual cycle and that type of sleep. What do you feel in terms of recovery? Could be sleep, nutrition, compression. Where do you feel there's research lacking? I know we've touched on it a bit, but where do you feel that there's just not enough research to be saying, the Oura Ring is, sorry to name drop on the call, but this is good for sleep, or this is good for tracking nutrition, or that compression types are good for recovery? Where do you feel there's merit, but more research needs to be done?
Yeah, look, I think unfortunately you're right with some of the commercially available devices, especially for monitoring sleep. What we tend to find is that there's not a lot of research on them. They tend to go to market before they've been validated. So, and then it's up to us to do those. So we've just finished a big study using the Whoop, and we've got a couple of papers coming out about that. So I think that technology validation stuff is important, especially when people start using them. But for us, for me particularly, I think about, yes, there's are the devices accurate and reliable and valid and all those things, but importantly, how are they used, and who's giving the feedback, and what feedback is given, and how is that relationship with the athlete and the practitioner? So that behavior change aspect for me is really interesting, and an area that I think is definitely lacking. Is we all know what to do, but what are the best strategies? How do we create the best environment to help people make good decisions? So I think that's a big area that's lacking. I think there's also still big questions around the periodization of recovery for adaptation. And especially in elite athletes, we see very few studies coming out with high level athletes. And, some of the research is fantastic and it gives some insight into mechanisms, but we really don't know how transferable that is to the elite athlete. So someone training 3 times a day rather than, 3 times a week. So that question is still around the use, particularly of hydrotherapies, hasn't really been answered. So there's been a lot of work on ice baths, not as much on contrast baths. And, with my experience with athletes, that's the thing they do more than anything else. Yes. But for some reason, the ice baths have been the focus of the work, and also the thing to get the bad name. So how we periodize nutrition, we periodize training. How should we be periodizing recovery to maximize adaptation to training? So another big area there that I think is lacking.
Yeah. Okay. And you mentioned that with the behavioral changes in your experience so you've obviously done a lot of reviews and a lot of papers on, what should you be doing with your athletes? In your experience, how difficult is it to actually get those athletes to have those? Because a lot of them don't have your phone here. You have certain lights, make sure a couple of hours you're doing this, no caffeine, how difficult is it to get elite athletes to adopt those changes?
Yeah, I think it can be very difficult, no question. But I think it's not a black and white. There's a sliding scale. In the last 2 years, I've worked with, and I won't name names, but 2 very, very high-level female professional soccer teams. And I cannot say how easy they were to work with, how inquisitive they were, how well they did their sleep monitoring and they completed their diaries. These girls were just, tell me what to do and I'm going to do it. So there's that aspect where I found that they were extraordinary to work with. And if I could work with both of those teams, I would be, if that's all I did for the rest of my life, I'd be happy. But then there's other teams that I've worked with where, they have all the access to the most unbelievable facilities, some of the high profile US teams in particular, a lot of money, a lot of access to equipment, and a lot of the world class recovery facilities, and you just can't get them to use it. And so, you know, I think so, and it does depend a little bit on the sport and the gender and and the culture of the environment. I think in my experience, the times when an athlete will engage in some of these activities in terms of behavior change and doing all the things they can do, it's either they're injured and they need help, they're towards the end of their career and they want to, you know, squeeze every last, you know, aspect out of their career, or maybe they're not getting selected. And so they're kind of at that point where they're ready to listen. But if you're working with a highly paid elite athlete, who's pretty good at what they do and probably are going to be pretty good at what they do regardless of whether you work with them or not, it can be hard to make change. But on the whole, I think athletes now are starting to understand that sleep's important. They're engaging. They may start to make some changes. So not saying that all athletes are bad. There's just some that are certainly, you know, are very, very challenging.
Yes. Yeah, I think that's the issue with elites. As you say, the problem is you've got a full team, half of them will adopt, half of them won't, and then you're torn between, you know, what do you do? So, Shona, I mean, that's been great. Thank you so much. One last thing I wanted to touch on is for anyone working with elite sport, or even for themselves, in terms of sleep, because obviously that's where your main focus is. What are the couple of takeaways that people should be looking for A, themselves, and B, their athletes? What should you be doing? What does a research say that this is what you should be doing, but don't listen to this?
Yeah, good question. Look, I think, you know, in terms of tips around sleep, you know, there's things like maintaining a good routine, bed and wake time at the same time. I think not pushing your sleep out to really late at night or early in the morning because you're doing something that, you know, you're on Netflix or, you know, social media or something. So just prioritizing sleep, getting a good routine, trying to look and say, okay, if I have to be up at this time, that means I need to go to bed. You know, it's not rocket science. And so I think it's a combination of, you know, just doing the little simple things that we all know work for sleep. If you're someone that likes to monitor, or you're with a group of athletes and you want to monitor them, there's plenty of tools out there, whether it's diaries or watches, from simple commercially available devices through to research grade. You know, they're all available. There's all options. But again, it comes down to how are you using this equipment and this technology, or these diaries, or this information? How are you feeding it back to the athlete, and what sorts of things? I think probably the last thing is to think about is what things, you know, it's easy to blame the athlete and say, you know, you're staying up late and you're doing this and you're doing that. But what about the things that we do? We schedule flights early in the morning instead of going the night before. We have training sessions at 6 a.m. and the athlete lives an hour away. You know, there's things that we impose on athletes. Competition times, now often nothing that we can really do to change that, but there's things that are outside of the things that are behavioral that the athletes might do wrong. So I think it's important to think about what we do, and then it's important to think about what the athlete does, and to then educate both parties about how you can make some changes to just protect sleep.
Absolutely. Shona, thank you so much. So guys, that concludes our episode 2 of our ACU Sprint Research. Shona, thank you so much for taking the time and coming on.
Thank you, Jamie.
It's been a pleasure. So this is the last week we'll be riding solo. Last week was Dan, this week myself. Next week will be both myself and Dan. So once again, guys, subscribe to our channel, take a look at the video. Let us know if you have any questions or thoughts. But once again, Shona, thank you so much.
Thanks, Jamie. Thank you.